Welcome to the Spawn Chunks, episode number 320 for Monday, October 21st, 2024. This is a podcast all about Minecraft, recorded on all of the major podcasting platforms and available on video on YouTube. My name is Joel Duggan, but joining as always is my friend Johnny, who you might know as Pixarus on the interwebs.
Hello. We've been talking sound and vision in the pre-show. That's sound and vision for recordings and streams, not the David Bowie album. But we've been talking about that on the Render Distance. That's the extended version of the podcast, which you can get if you're a patron of the show. Over at patreon.com/thespawnchunks is the place to go if you want to support us. We have monthly hangouts with our patrons. There's one coming up next Sunday or Saturday. I'm not sure which day we're recording it. We'll have to figure that out. But we're going to be talking to our patrons about what they've been doing in Minecraft this month, what they've been building, etc. And it's always a really good time. We have quarterly hangouts as well, where we go over the facts and figures, the behind the scenes of the podcast, so those are always worth checking out as well. And other events in the Patreon calendar are announced throughout the year, so if you want to get on board and get that inside scoop, that's patreon.com/thespawnchunks.
So what have you been up to in Minecraft this week, my friend?
This week, in the Minecraft Survival Guide world, I've been planning my city layout. So having landscaped this area, having done a bunch of raising cliffs and figuring out flattening landscapes, trying to figure out where I'm going to build the central stuff, and finally having decided on the theme of wind power and wind travel, I'm now figuring out where I want the locations and stuff to go. So similar to the days when you were in the very early stages of drafting up West Hill and putting down, roads and outlines of where I want houses to go, this is going to be more of a modern feeling, not necessarily modern aesthetically, but industrial feeling city. So it's a little bit more crowded. It's a little bit more kind of, apartments and high rises here and there. The main thing it's focused on right now is the train station, which has the nether portal connection with the Iceboat Road. So I've started from there and figured, well, a train station probably needs a little ticket kiosk, and then the commercial area of town is going to be clustered around the train station because it's either people stepping off of a train and being like, where do I go to get coffee? And, little bits and pieces the transport hub is going to have some commercial stuff around it so that people who are just visiting immediately get the tourist trap shops, they get, the newspaper stand, that kind of thing. And then outside of that, in a slightly larger semicircle right now, I have the residential areas. So there are going to be some places where there are apartments above shops, if the shop's just the ground floor and the apartment is the floor above. There are going to be some that are more I'm thinking New York brownstone kind of vibes right now, just kind of right street, city apartments that, terrace of houses, shared walls, and a couple of floors to each of them, kind of cramped together, but still with their own individual character. And then further out from that, it gets a little bit more, I won't say suburban, because I don't think the area I'm developing is really big enough to create suburbs, but something that feels a bit more kind of comfortable, detached houses and older houses and that kind of thing. So I'm working on a fairly big scale. I want things to be fairly ambitious. I'm sticking to player scale in terms of the individual builds, but in terms of the overall area, I want to go quite large and have a lot of variety in there. And now it's just a matter of nailing down build styles, which is going to take a little bit of time to itself. So I'm actually quite happy that there are a few distractions coming through from Survival Guide, with the bundles update being relatively soon, probably this week. I'm expecting to do a bunch of episodes about how useful bundles are in different situations, and I've got a couple of other things I want to take care of as little side projects, like moving villagers into certain shop environments and figuring out how we can keep them safe while still feeling like they're part of an organic city structure, and, zombie sieges being possible whilst not necessarily being, dangerous to the villagers is, an interesting balance to work out. I'm also considering maybe also pacifying some pillagers and getting them to work in certain areas. Maybe, there's areas of, manufacturing and stuff where they're likely to get a little bit of dirt on their faces and, or ash or something. And I did that with Season 1 of Survival Guide with Founder's Forge, with the area at the beginning being a lot more kind of pre-industrial, almost dwarven level engineering kind of stuff, where they were mining resources from this geothermal ravine. And yeah, there was going to be ash kind of spreading to the trees and everything as well. Kind of makes me wish that pale oakwood existed back in those days, because I feel like I could do a better job of it now. But yeah, Survival Guide is starting to creep back into my permanent routine now, and I'm having a lot of fun imagining this city project, gathering some concept art, and then getting set for building it.
Have you thought about incorporating protecting the villagers into like the design, like a walled city, or having certain traps or like anti-zombie like traps in the middle of the city, or buildings that would like attract the zombies so that they could get like pulled away from the villagers or something like that? That would be fun.
There's definitely some good ideas there, yeah. Like, there's a few things. A while ago, I considered trying an approach that was sort of similar to tower defense in the way of, like, forcing the zombies to walk over stuff that was going to damage them. But then I realized that only makes sense if you've got a bird's eye view of it and you don't have to navigate that stuff yourself. So, like, I would get really tired of, like, avoiding tripwires and magma blocks and everything else, right? And so there are a couple of, like, fairly simple safeguards, like, if you make sure that the villagers are contained within a building that they're not going to leave, then you can put all sorts of stuff in the way to make sure that the zombies don't get in. But if I want a villager to be running like a newspaper stand, then there's only so much, trapdoors and glass panes and that kind of stuff that I can do without to make sure that baby zombies can't get in. I think that's the major problem, is that you have baby zombies who can, sneak in one block gaps, and then if the area isn't lit up by block light, you also have pillagers who can spawn in the day as a patrol and then shoot through the window. So it justifies in any number of ways making a village a trading hall, but I want this to feel like a more living city. And if the villagers don't work out, then I've got other ways that I can maybe make that work. I really want to incorporate allays into it because they're also a flying mob, right? So imagining walking down a city street and the allays are kind of passing from building to building almost like birds. Like, I love that idea. I think we can maybe do something with that. So yeah, if the villagers don't work out, if ultimately my newspaper stand vendor dies an unfortunate death, then I can figure out something else, I think. But yeah, if I bring some pillagers in and like have passive pillagers walking around, they're going to scare the villagers, but they're not going to necessarily harm the villagers unless they have a crossbow. So there's maybe some compromises I can figure out there once we're into the mechanical side of things and less into the building side.
It reminds me of an older video that CubFan135 made about being able to control mobs and having all this control over the environment, at end game when you're at this level as a Minecraft player, and how frustrating it is when you want to build certain things, whether it's a network in the nether and you don't want to use slabs everywhere because you don't want zombified piglin spawning in places, but you're kind of stuck with it. You kind of have to deal with these guys wandering around your tunnels. Even though they're not going to harm you unless you harm them, it's just visually maybe you don't want them. And same thing with like skeletons and zombies, like having to light everything up in order to keep the zombies safe. If you want to incorporate villagers into your build like you are, then you're going to attract zombies from afar. And unless you have the right measures inside, it's just not going to be possible. And I remember, I think his solution was a beacon or some additive to a beacon that would then like repel hostile mobs from an area. And sure, make it expensive, like make it endgame, like have it be part of like, well, you've beaten the dragon, you've got your shulker boxes, like you've done all the things that you can do in Minecraft progressively. Here's the reward in that you can set up this thing that basically like is like a bug light for, for zombies, or an anti, like a mosquito candle, essentially. It just kind of keeps everything away. And that, I think that would be really cool creatively. Like, I think there are things that I would like to do in Minecraft as well that would be more enjoyable if I did not have to also worry about, having mobs around. And I guess that's one of the arguments for, peaceful mode and that kind of stuff. Like, if you're not worried about progression any longer, you just want to build something nice. I guess the issue there is that peaceful mode also in survival hamstrings you with the block choices. Like, you just can't get certain blocks. And so you're stuck in that way. So it's kind of this weird, like, you get 6 in one and half dozen of the other in the two different modes. You can't really have it all. Which is too bad, because I think that it would be really fun to be able to control, villagers in that way and not have them like be in their single cells or whatever it is that you have to do to keep them from either walking off cliffs or just being, done in by zombies.
Yeah, well, I'll update you on that in future and see if I come up with any decent solutions. But a lot of it is going to be circumstantial, right? A lot of it's going to be like, does it look good to still have all of these villager measures in place, or am I just going to roll the dice and make sure I sleep before it reaches midnight and there's a chance of a zombie siege, or limit the amount of beds that are in the area so that doesn't happen? It doesn't detect that there's already a village there. Like, there's a few ways you can do it. Either way, the other thing I've been doing this week is returning to Minecraft Bingo because I wanted something as a fun distraction to play this weekend, and Minecraft Bingo has a new beta in 1.21.2 pre-release 5, which we'll talk about in the news because that's one of the more recent ones. Noinine Sir has been back at work, has added armadillo scutes, wolf armor, and a light blue bundle to the bingo card from the more recent items, and has rebalanced a couple of the others. Like, you don't need to get as many like diamond tools and stuff don't show up as much anymore. I think white stained glass and brown banners are on there, and a couple of other items have been swapped out. So there's still a nice variety in there. It really gets you using parts of the game that you don't interact with too much. And when you got to get wolf armor, you've got to get 2 brushes for that because you need enough armadillo scutes to be able to craft the wolf armor, and so it really makes you think a few steps ahead of what you're actually trying to obtain, and it's fun. Like, I like that whole gameplay idea. It feels very kind of stimulating and very a different way to play Minecraft than the average survival grind. So yeah, I'm into it, and I've enjoyed playing with bundles in a more fast-paced environment because most of the time I'm using them just kind of store my workstations and stuff away when I'm building, but using them in a minigame context, it means that if you're not confident that you won't end up needing something later, you can stash something in a bundle instead of throwing it on the ground and then going, oh, I threw away the, ink sacks or whatever when I knew I would need like a book and quill later on. And I should have been thinking about that at the time. Now you can just tuck the 1s or 2s of those things that you've got in a bundle, and then you can just rummage through whenever you feel like you need something later. So that actually saved my bacon a couple of times. I kept some sand blocks that I realized, oh wait, I need to smelt those because I need a glass bottle for part of the bingo card. And there's like little things like that that actually prove really useful. So honestly, yeah, bundles have their place in Minecraft Bingo even before they found their way into the main game, and I'm kind of happy about that.
Yeah, no, that would be really useful for that kind of stuff, especially because Minecraft Bingo, it's always a brand new world. Like, you're never kind of starting from any kind of return to the game. You're always starting over again, and I think that's where bundles really shine is early game. Yeah,
I think they've got their place in late game, but a lot of people are going to find them probably like they're going to click with you in early game. I feel like if they click with you at all, so that's a good way to use them. I highly recommend it. So that's me. How about you? What's new in your gaming life this week?
Gaming life continues to be satisfactory. I've made a lot of progress in the Satisfactory playthrough that we started when the 1.0 launched. I'm now through phase 3 of the space elevator and is roughly as far as I am progression-wise in the other playthroughs that I have. So even the 1,100 hours of Devastator, I'm still only in phase 4 and very early in phase 4. I think I've unlocked the tier 7 and I've finished tier 7, but I've not unlocked anything in tier 8 because tier 8 gets into like nuclear power and other really more complicated mechanics. But aluminum is where I finished in Devastator, and aluminum is where I've started now. In the first phases of phase 4 in the new playthrough. And something that I was thinking about a lot as I was designing another factory, I did like a computer factory, and I've got trains on the go now, and I did like a hover train design. So like rather than having your trains supported around the world, I designed this little blueprint, which it's a brilliant system in Satisfactory. I'm not sure if I've talked about it much on the show, but basically you design the thing once with all the different building parts. Like, imagine building a street section or one of your townhouses. Like, say one of your townhouses was small enough that would fit in like a 32 by 32 by 32 block cube, right? And then you could just click and place that as often as you wanted. As long as you had the resources, like as long as you had all the blocks in your inventory, you could just click and place that thing over and over again. So maybe not the most creative thing, but when you're doing something that requires a lot of repetition, like a train line or a factory that has like 30 or 40 or 50 smelters all lined up doing the exact same thing, you can kind of pre-program these blueprints. But for world-spanning train lines, it's great. So I designed what looks like a anti-gravity pad for the trains. So it's got like lights that shine down that look like kind of energy, and it's got a cool kind of like industrial looking design. And I just placed that like every 12 tracks, like every 12 foundations. So that would be like every 160 meters or so. And it just looks like it's defying gravity. Like, it just looks space age and looks like it's kind of floating around. So once you get the trains in line, then it's a lot of fun to start moving things around. I'm doing another factory that's designed around Sunstreaker, who was a G1 Lamborghini, yellow and red and orange, very brightly colored. And I think Sideswipe was his brother, both like another Lamborghini, but it was a red Lamborghini. And because the toys were basically just like reskins of one, like repaints of each other, they made the characters in the show like fraternal twins or something. It was really funny. So that's been fun because it's been building with bright colors. Like Wheeljack was white with like red and accents and like green highlights, and Sunstreaker is bright yellow with like orange and red highlights and maybe some black for some of the deeper parts, like the robotic parts. So it's been really cool to build in Satisfactory with like bright primary colors. You know, like if I'm making copper, then I'm painting all the machines orange. If I'm making computers, I'm painting the machines bright primary yellow. So I've had all these swatches in my inventory to be able to color everything, and it's great to have that kind of control. And something that I feel like I've been kind of mulling over a lot over the week is like comparing the experience in Minecraft to the creative experience in Satisfactory. And something that comes to mind is like the control over the color, the fact that you can kind of paint things whatever shade of color you want, almost like there are some limitations. But then also, I just really like modern lighting in games. Like I forget after spending so much time in Minecraft, and you pop into something like Satisfactory that's Unreal Engine 4 and has been developed over the last recent 5 years, and is just meant to be this like beautifully lit immersive game. I can't crank it to its max because my computer couldn't handle it, but it's just a very pretty game. And for what it is, it almost has no business being as pretty as it is. And it really makes me long for better graphics in Minecraft. I remember when the RTX stuff first came out, and I was like, man, like I really wish that one, I had access to this, and two, that Java Minecraft could look like that all the time. And it's made me think about, you know, upgrading my PC next year and having the ability to stream and play Minecraft with shaders on and not have it be a frame rate, you know, drop situation. Keep it up at 60 at least. And I would really like to get there, because I think that's one thing that I do find, I don't want to say keeps me from going back to Minecraft, but when I think about getting back into Minecraft, that's something where I kind of go, oh, right. It's going to be very flat. It's going to be very 16 pixel, very, you know, not 16 colors, because there's a lot more than 16 colors in Minecraft, but it just has that retro vibe and has that limited vibe as far as the lighting goes. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And I've been thinking a lot about the Create mod. And from a performance perspective, like what other mods I might want to pair with it. I did a little bit of research, and you can just add the mod. Like you don't have to do anything else. I mean, you have to have like, I think the Fabric mod loader in order to do it, but we have that running anyway because I have performance mods on the Citadel, and I use performance mods for my PC client side as well. But I was trying to think of like what mods that I have would I want to bring over with the Create mod, and we don't really have many gameplay mods. It's mostly just performance. So I might just look at the standard performance mods for lighting, rendering, you know, chunk loading, redstone, like anything that makes the game just a little bit more efficient, because I've heard that Create mod can be a little bit taxing on the system. And so I'm looking into that, and I think that's what I'm going to do, just to try and test it out and see what it's going to be like. But it's going to have that kind of, it has that gears and conveyor belt vibe to it, that and very similar to what you're talking about with like your industrial kind of city with like the fans and kind of steampunky. But I'm trying to figure out whether Create mod also has extra textures. Like, does it have other blocks that I could build in, like metal blocks or anything like that, that's going to make it a different experience? Because I don't want to just play vanilla Minecraft with the Create mod and have the Create mod be like, well, you can do gears and you can do belts and you can move stuff around, but you're still going to be building out of like oak logs and cobblestone. And I don't want that experience. Like, I'm hoping for something just a little bit better. So I'm going to look to see what other mods people typically pair with Create, stuff that might work well together. I don't want to get too into like a big mod pack, but I'm hoping to try and sort that out. So if anybody listening actually has experience with Create mod specifically, let me know if there is like a pack or like a moderate small pack, or a pair of mods, other things that go really well with Create, like Create and then like these other two texture mods or these other two things that tend to pair really well with it. Or maybe it was even designed to be on its own. I don't know. But if you know, let us know. spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, because it's not something I have any experience with other than just watching a couple of other creators that I admire play it on YouTube.
Yeah, Create has been going through something of a renaissance lately. It seems to be one of those mods that people seem to come back to a lot. And so, yeah, I expect there'll be a fair amount of people who have experience with it lately. So hopefully we got some folks out there. I only tinkered with it very, very briefly, and I think I saw when I was exploring the New Life server, there were a couple of caves that had materials that Create had added. I think it was a couple of like decorative stone types, if anything, but they might also have been components in certain contraptions as well. So yeah, I imagine there's going to be stuff out there. Otherwise, there's probably a few mods that add more biomes, and with those biomes add other materials. So there might be some more modern looking wood types, or just some different wood types to change up what you're used to from vanilla. And if you're looking for other stuff to build with, I expect there's a few bits and pieces out there. But again, there's resource packs for stuff like that as well. Like even a more modern resource pack might give it the edge over something that feels very medieval and kind of like low-tech fantasy being combined with something that's a bit more industrial the way Create is. So yeah, obviously would be really great to hear from anybody who has experience with Create, but I'm sure you'll dial it in. Like having had the experience of Satisfactory now and knowing what you're looking for a bit closer, aesthetically speaking, from Minecraft, I imagine it's a matter of time before you'll get something that pulls you back in.
Well, speaking of dialing things in, Mojang is dialing it in on the Bundles of Bravery, and we've got some news hits to relay to you this week. Minecraft Java Edition 1.21.2 pre-release 4 was published on October 15th. The bug fixes of note in this pre-release are that the text on maps in item frames renders through blocks. Compasses do not point in the correct direction when in the player's left hand. Clocks are mirrored and spin in the wrong direction when in the player's left hand. The landing points of arrows are lower than previous versions. Crafting an item that has not yet been crafted removes all tabs from the recipe book other than the topmost tab, and sliding down honey blocks is still different from previous versions. Going into pre-release 5 for Minecraft Java Edition 1.21.2, this was published on October 16th. Just a couple of quick fixes here. The recipe book is not updated when one of the available recipes is used, and arrows shot at walls when facing south sometimes end up vertical instead of horizontal. Moving into the release candidates, the first release candidate was published on October 17th, 2024. Intersection chests in trial chambers are not generating correctly. Projectiles visually fall when relogging, and the client sometimes rejects a set passengers packet. It looks to be a lot of projectile and kind of like flip-flopping between left and right hand bugs that they've been fixing over the last little bit. So these fixes are coming in fast and furious. As they've stated before, when they get into pre-release and release candidate, the schedule is no longer just on Wednesdays. It comes out kind of like whenever they can fix these bugs. The full list of bugs and the links to all of these articles will be up on the spawnchunks.com, so you can read those there.
The other thing we've got for you is a Minecraft Bedrock Edition beta and preview. This is 1.21.50.24. This was published October 17th, so kind of concurrently with the release candidate for Java Edition 1.21.2. It focuses on the winter drop features, though, in the experimental features. The Pale Garden has had some changes here, which I thought were notable. They've tweaked the size and placement of Pale Moss patches. Pale Moss patches are now larger when naturally generated and have a chance to naturally generate without being adjacent to a Pale Oak tree. Pale Moss patches also have less tall grass growing on them. They've increased the Pale Oak tree density to match Java Edition's interpretation of the biome, and removed flowers and mushrooms, which no longer generate inside the biome. Pale Oak saplings now grow into Pale Oaks with hanging Pale Moss on them, but no Pale Moss patch at their base. While in the biome, the sky is now completely grey instead of blue at the horizon as it was previously. The colour of the stripped Pale Oak logs on Bedrock Edition is now brighter, matching the rest of the wood set. The textures of the Pale Oak sign and hanging signs have been adjusted for consistency with other items in the wood set, and the Pale Oak boat with chest item has been adjusted for consistency with other boats with chest. A few changes came to the Creaking Heart as well. It is now no longer movable by pistons, can no longer be used as fuel, and spawning and despawning its creaking now emits vibrations, but from the creaking's position, not from the Creaking Heart block itself. There are a few changes to blocks and items as well. To quote the changelog, we've fixed several issues where the tool used to mine some blocks didn't affect the drop or mining speed correctly. Related to these changes, any block that drops when its supporting block is broken will also drop when mined with any tool. So to recap those changes, the blast furnace, cauldron, dispenser, dropper, enchanting table, furnace, hopper, and smoker now only drop when broken with a pickaxe. Some blocks that require a supporting block now always drop when broken with any tool. There is a list, but it's mostly the metal doors and different types of pressure plates. Budding amethyst is now slower to mine with an improper tool, and the bell, brewing stand, crafter, ender chest, lantern, and soul lantern, which always drop something regardless of how they are broken, are now mined even faster when using the correct or incorrect tool. Note that the ender chest still requires silk touch or it'll break down into obsidian, but it will still drop something. The changelog also has a bunch of tweaks and fixes for general gameplay, graphics, and item textures, UI updates, and a couple of small fixes for realms. You can find those at the feedback.minecraft.net changelog that we'll have linked in our show notes at thespawnchunks.com. A reminder for Bedrock Edition players on PlayStation 5 that you'll be able to play the native PS5 edition when it launches October 22nd. We covered this on the show a few weeks ago. The release date was announced on September 19th. We'll have a link to that as well in our show notes if anyone wants to catch up. There was a preview version earlier in the year, but the official release date was announced, and it's going to be on October 22nd. If you already have Minecraft for PlayStation 4, you'll be able to get the PS5 native version on the PS5 console for free. Just access the PlayStation Store via your PS5, ensuring that you're logged in, and claim your digital copy. If you don't own Minecraft for PlayStation platforms, you'll find it in the usual online stores or retail stores close to you.
Well, I know you are very excited about Bundles of Bravery coming sooner than later, and I have to say that I'm pretty impressed with the speed at which this drop is coming. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether it's just old conditioning from doing this show about Minecraft and keeping tabs on Mojang development for 6 years, or it's just my general kind of mode of operation when it comes to video game developers announcing when stuff is coming, and when specific dates are not given, but the ballpark is in the coming weeks. My brain defaults to like 6 to 8 weeks.
Sure.
Not 2 to 4 weeks. You know what I mean? Like within the month is not where my brain thinks. I think, however many weeks we can fit in before we should probably describe it as months. Like what is that?
Yeah.
When you get into 3 months plus, you have to say in the coming months, but when you're dealing with weeks, I always kind of pitch it farther down the field, and I'm surprised. And hopefully this is not an anomaly. Like I'm hoping that the announcements of future drops, what they contain and how far they are away, will be at a quicker pace. For all the reasons that we've discussed in the show before. So I think it's great. Like I think it's great that it's coming. I think it's great that they're going through and making these last minute changes, and they seem to be a lot of the fine tuning things that are happening. And so I'm looking forward to when it actually gets out there.
Yeah, I think this is indicative of their new development cadence, right? Like, I think we knew that bundles were coming soon anyway, because we had a bunch of snapshots involving them before Minecraft Live announced that they were coming as a feature drop, and it was being bundled with hardcore mode for Bedrock. So yeah, people expected bundles to be arriving, but it was whether they were arriving with what's now the winter drop, the Pale Garden update, and so people weren't sure about that. So I think it's nice to have something immediately that's going to be at least a short-term game changer before any of the bigger changes end up arriving later. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to finally introducing bundles to Survival Guide. I considered turning them on as a data pack in the early stages, because they were just sort of lingering in Java code for a really long time, and you could just enable a recipe. So I figured it might have been worth doing, but then I was so fixated on this being the vanilla experience that I didn't want to allow myself that and then have to answer questions constantly about how to get them. And I'm quite happy I did that now, because of course they have changed a little bit fundamentally in terms of how they are used and accessed. And so doing an early tutorial about those would have meant I have to correct myself later and, signpost that tutorial was no longer accurate. But finally, we have bundles coming to presumably Java Edition and Bedrock Edition this week. This also means hardcore mode coming to Bedrock Edition, so best of luck to all the Bedrock players if they're embarking on their first hardcore journey. And good luck to anyone who's picking up Minecraft for the first time on PS5, although you're probably playing on PS4 Edition before this if you have a PlayStation at all. Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to now seeing what happens to the Pale Garden, because presumably any sort of development focus is going to switch to that and whatever comes after it. So we'll be hearing a lot more about the Pale Garden. There's no more fine-tuning for the bundles update. It's just going to be Pale Garden snapshots from this point onwards. And I wanted to include the Bedrock Edition changelog because there were a few notable points in there that sounded like a direction was being taken with the Pale Garden. So we have pale oak trees no longer spreading pale moss when grown by the player, but still generating hanging moss. And I think that's significant because previously I thought, well, that's kind of like spruce trees spreading podzol, right? The 2x2 spruces doing that. And I thought, well, if they're going to have that behavior as part of it, then maybe players can incorporate that into some sort of hybrid wood farm and moss farm, because you can obviously farm moss for bone meal and a variety of other things just as a building block if you wanted to. And now you could still combine them in theory, but you don't have to, or you wouldn't want to. You would probably end up doing them separately just for simplicity of the two contraptions individually. And I think I can see why they've made this decision, because 2x2 spruce can get annoying when it spreads podzol, so some players might have been annoyed by both the moss spreading and also how many blocks moss can spread to, because I think it will take over stone and stone variants in the same way that green moss can. But I guess with spruce, at least players have the option of farming the single sapling trees, so you could avoid podzol spreading if you didn't want to, whereas right now pale oak trees only have the 2x2 because their dark oak trees are different color, so you would be forced to interact with pale moss, and that could get kind of irritating. So I think while I will maybe miss the functionality in theory, I think in practice it's going to work out better for players just getting comfortable with the farming of that new wood type.
And you could still use bone meal on a pale moss block in the same sort of farm that I have, right? So you're not going to have a tree farm, like a pale oak tree farm, moss farm combo, but you can still have a moss and pale moss combo.
Yes.
Like, just depending on what block you're bone mealing. So it's still there, but it is separate. I get it, because like I've done a lot of 2x2 spruce mining to get all of the spruce trapdoors that I need for the Citadel. And one of the things that I've started doing was, after some testing and frustrating landscaping being turned into podzol, I now plant the 2x2 spruce trees 3 blocks above the ground, because the podzol won't spread that far down. Or I would find like a big intersection in one of my roads that's like, I don't know, 12 or 15 blocks in diameter, and just put a couple of dirt blocks down in the middle. And then only those 4 dirt blocks would turn into podzol. Well, potentially blocks underneath the stone, but I don't care because I can't see them. And so I've had to be conscious of that as I've been wanting to quickly get some spruce for spruce chests, or whatever it is I need them for, trapdoors, that kind of thing. And so having that control and not having the moss spread from the pale oak tree is probably a good thing, especially if, like, I don't know if players are going to be using pale oak as an accent tree. Like, maybe you just want one. Or maybe you're trying to cover your biome in pale oak trees by growing them on your own. And I can see that being kind of a problem if you have an existing build. If you're making a tree farm, it's probably kind of gridded off, and you're not terribly worried about what these trees are growing on, because you're probably just walking over it to harvest it. You're not really focused too much on what's actually in the ground. But yeah, it would be tricky, especially if you already had a tree farm set up to handle podzol and trees. Maybe it's like lined with stone or some other block that the spruce tree does not turn into podzol, but then moss, like you mentioned, would turn the stone frame of what you have into podzol, into moss. So yeah, it gets a little bit tricky. But it's interesting that they're dialing that back, and I wonder if that's the only reason. Like, I wonder if there's more biome related reasons, or if it's like a grass color thing. Like, I'm not sure whether that was just like, oh, this looks really funny. Like, if you grow a pale oak tree in the middle of a plains biome with all this lush green grass, and then underneath the pale oak tree it's also devoid of color, like, I wonder if that would look funny, like if it looked more like a graphical error rather than this pale tree growing in the middle of a lush biome. Like, it might look like the area underneath the tree might be too close to the diameter of the leaves, and it might just look like a weird chunk, kind of in there. I could see that being very visually strange.
Yeah, but I like the fact that they're giving us more control, I guess, is the main thing. Like, the lack of control is something that players would struggle with, so maybe that's just, an easy fix for pain points that could arise from something like that. The other thing, speaking of the biome, is that pale moss blocks don't have to naturally generate around the base of a pale oak tree anymore, so there can be patches of the moss even in clearings in the pale oak forest, which I think is another smart move. It kind of detaches them from the tree and maybe makes some of the instances in which you have pale moss carpet with the, tendrils of it growing up the tree, makes those a little bit more unique and interesting and like at least less frequent. They're not going to be all over the place. It's going to be an interaction that players notice subtly here and there instead of it just being surrounded by it constantly. Last of all, they've removed flowers and mushrooms that generated in the biome on Bedrock Edition, which I don't think generated at all on Java Edition, but I presume this was a holdover from it being, the code for a dark oak forest maybe, and then they just removed some of the foliage that would naturally generate in a dark oak. And I wonder if they are just clearing out the brightly colored foliage that didn't fit from general forest generation, or are they making the decision that no flowers or mushrooms are ever going to generate in the biome, right? I don't know if this feels just like we're trying to experiment and try and find the right fit for things, or if we are kind of nixing the idea of any other foliage than the trees and the moss in this area at all. Because, I mean, first of all, I think the brown mushrooms still fit really well. Like, I think in terms of the color palette of the area, they feel pale enough naturally that they suit, even with the paler grass and everything. You've also got there's side faces of dirt blocks maintain their color even in different biomes with different grass colors. And then there's maybe a couple of flowers we've discussed already that would fit, and maybe just the green stem of them feels too bright for the biome, but I would be happier if the biome color applied more to the greener parts of those plants, like the flower, the head of the flower remains the same, the petals or whatever they would be remain the same, but the stem could change color with biome color and be affected in the same way that leaves are. I would honestly prefer that, because then you could sneak in things like wither roses and lily of the valley and some of the paler flowers that already exist, and they would fit really nicely and potentially even make it a destination to get stuff from Pale Garden, because I struggle to find lily of the valley sometimes when I'm looking for those specifically.
Yeah. You run into the same problem with existing blocks or existing flowers, like the berry bushes, right? Like they look great in a taiga biome, but you put them in a plains biome and they have just the wrong green.
Yeah,
it would be nice if it would be nice if the green of the plant shifted to be more in line with the green of the biome, not the same, but like the same hue values, like less blue, more yellow green, that kind of stuff would be great. I'm with you on the idea of having more foliage, obviously, in the Pale Garden, but I'm wondering if this as actually more of like a clean slate. Like I wonder if it's not like have no foliage, just like have no vanilla foliage like happening in this right now, and give us a clearer slate for custom foliage. Like we want only certain things to grow in here. And maybe that's coming. Like that could be an interesting way. And I'm reaching a bit, but could be an interesting way to look at this. Like if they're making sure that there's nothing growing in there to offset the color, maybe they want more control so that when they go in, they can actually say like what is going to grow, and have that be specific to the Pale Garden biome. Because I agree, I think it needs more stuff going around. I even think like they're a little bright, but you could get away with the warped mushrooms or the warped wort. The little tendrils and grasses that you see in the nether, because they're that kind of pale teal, and they're still colorful, but they're not like primary colors. They're a little bit more of that kind of bluey gray kind of range. And I think that could be really cool. So I do hope they go down the mushroom road. I feel like we've brought it up a lot of times, and our listeners have brought it up before too, but that seems to be a pretty broad accepted, like this is a great opportunity to bring in some mushrooms, like you could really do some cool stuff here.
Yeah, the community's going to be banging that drum until the update comes out, I'm pretty sure, unless we end up getting some sort of flowers or some sort of confirmation of new stuff coming to the Pale Garden besides what we already know about. There may even be some of that in the chunk mail inbox this week, so we're going to dive into that. This is going to be our chunk mail dispenser episode, so typically we like to dedicate one episode of each month to listener emails. If you'd like to email the show, the email address is spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. It helps us immensely if you can keep your emails short and to the point with a descriptive subject line. Helps us include them in the show and everything. This first one is to do with the Pale Garden. It comes in from Nico with the subject of a Pale Garden willow. Hi there. I think the new Pale Garden biome could use a slightly more unique tree by leaning pale oak trees more towards a willow tree. To stay in line with the idea of a dark oak forest variant, this could be achieved by simply adding some droop to the leaf generation, or go the extra mile of making the trees slightly crooked. This would also match the pale oak sapling more. Nico died mauled by a creaking while judging a pale oak tree.
I mean, it's sad to see Nico go, but I mean, if you're going to go, then I think sitting there and pondering, like, how could we improve this tree? That's a pretty Minecraft way to go. I think that's a true,
Yes, really is.
true note of a Minecraft player. Nico included a couple of screenshots to express what they are talking about. I've included them in our show notes, and I've also included them in our live chat, so people here today can follow along. And immediately, I like it. I prefer the one that leans. I like the way that they've just kind of like chunked it over in the same way that you see players do like custom willows or custom twisty spruce trees. I've done those before as well, and just kind of have them lean over. But really, it's the hanging leaves that I think sell this, along with the pale hanging moss. The one hang up that I think might be more of a function over fashion would be, depending on the topography in the area and how long the leaves hang from the pale oak trees, or the pale oak willows in this case, I could see it impeding player movement where pale moss doesn't. So I could see them maybe leaning more into the pale moss hanging down farther than the leaves. But a couple of blocks of leaves is fine, as long as you have about 3 blocks, I'd say, underneath the tree for players to get by, because it's very similar to the first time that you are riding a horse in Minecraft and you decide to go through the woods and you realize, oh, I can't, because I'm hitting my head on all of the leaf blocks.
I hate that.
And I think that you'd have a pretty frustrating experience, especially if you're running from the creaking and you're just like, why can't I like move? It's because like you're up against a leaf block that shouldn't be that low. So I feel like that could be a little bit frustrating, but I like the look, and I really like the point that it mimics the sapling, because the sapling has kind of like a crooked look to it, but the tree does not. And I think that's a weird kind of combo visually for just like players' expectations. Like, you look at a crooked little sapling and then you get a very straight tree, you're like, that's not quite what I was expecting there. And I also like the fact that this is not a huge redesign. It's not like, oh, these trees suck, here's my new completely different tree. It's more like, nope, it's meant to be a dark oak variant, so let's keep it 2x2 and let's just like make it a little droopy and make it a little crooked. And it's a subtle change, but I think it sets it apart.
Yeah, I think the sapling point is a really good one, because you look at dark oak saplings and they are thick already, and so that kind of implies the shape of the tree you're about to get, whereas, I think the sprite for these does feel a lot more bendy, and I think personally implies a single sapling tree almost. Like, I
agree
still,
too, yeah.
I still think they could use something that's a bit closer to one of the taller oak trees to fill out the pale garden and make it a little bit more diverse. But yeah, like you, I really like the willow idea. They introduced willows in the chat with Jasper Burstra introducing the pale garden, and like they talked about willows and how they were an inspiration for this, but then they settled on the pale hanging moss as a way of getting the droop into the trees without necessarily shaping the leaves that way. But having looked at this, I think it's a really compelling shape whilst not being a fundamentally huge change. And like you, I like the fact that the trunk can lean a little bit. Even the drooping leaves on the straight one feel a little bit more natural feeling. And I wonder if part of the design principle of introducing stuff like new trees from the Minecraft team themselves is intentionally simplifying the shapes, both to keep the world feeling blocky and also to give players room to improve on the natural world and improve upon Mojang's own work. It's kind of in a similar way to how we talked about village houses being very simple when they introduced the new village redesign in Village and Pillage, where they were improving on the original village designs from way back, but still keeping them, relatively flat walls, very simple roof shapes, a couple of material variations, but nothing that was like groundbreaking in terms of block palette, and certainly nowhere near the caliber of some stuff that players can design. And while you can put in these sort of awe-inspiring structures and trees and everything, that feels often that players have a standard to live up to, instead of everything looking a bit janky and the players going, well, I can improve on this, and maybe emboldening the player's idea from there instead of stopping them in their tracks and going, can I really build something that looks like it's going to fit around all of these magnificent trees? So, yeah, I get the sense that even though they've put some variation into some recent trees, like I think mangroves are probably the most complex, but I find even those, the leaf shapes are more blobby than they are realistic, right?
Yeah.
And like with cherry trees, those are very simple. Like the trunk is slightly more interesting than the average oak, but it's still just clusters of leaves on top of each of the offshoots of the trunk. And so players can do a lot more with those. I think what Mojang is hoping for is that players will see something like a pale oak biome and go, this could use a bit of a redesign, and do it themselves in-game and do what Nico has done with this email, but with the default generic-looking trees. Decide, hey, now that I know the shape of the landscape here, I can reshape this tree into a willow and make sure that it hangs the right way, that it's not going to impede movement, and have a little bit more character and a bit more life to it. And that becomes part of your work transforming the biome and becomes your achievement instead of theirs. I think that's maybe what they're going for at a push, but it is unfortunate when that butts up against the community's idea of what an update should be and makes it feel like Mojang are not putting a whole lot of effort into something, when I think in actuality they're putting a lot of consideration into not holding up the players' creative ideas and not showing off too much. It feels strange, especially when we are used to games being more spectacular these days, but I think Minecraft has to toe a really fine line when it comes to that.
This might be a very specific observation because I was flying around taking screenshots for the show, but I do find that they look really boring from above, the Pale Garden biomes.
Yeah.
Not that the roofed forest, the dark oak forest, is much better, but I find that because of the very simple shape of the canopy, it just kind of feels flat. And by giving these trees like that willow shape, that kind of dome or kind of umbrella look, you could end up with a little bit more peaks and valleys happening from above the canopy. Now, that's a very specific observation. You'd still see it if you're up on a mountain, or if you're building high nearby, you'd still look over the biome. So that's potential. And you don't really have to get that far above the trees, like 10 or 12 blocks, you're well above them to see across the biome. So I think there's some strengths here that could be not taken from the player, but I think that they can probably go somewhere in the middle, like with what you're talking about. I think they can go just a little bit where they are now, past where they are now, and then get to something like this. And something that I'm thinking about too is like, just because it has a 2x2 base doesn't mean that it has to have a 2x2 top, right? Like, what's to say that you can't have a single trunk tree spread out into something that has like 2 or 3 blocks at the base to give it that unique look, but then and that thick look at the bottom, but then also go up into something a little bit more spindly at the top, just to try and get a different shape and still maintain that thick bottom, and related to dark oak, but then kind of go up from there, and maybe still require it to be a 2x2 sapling situation where you have to plant them in a 2x2 grid, but then you get a very interesting looking tree. I think that could be very fun, and might look neat too if you were growing them and then on purpose removing all of the leaves and having them look like dead trees. Like if you wanted to have it look kind of gnarled and crooked, I think that would be more fun if they had kind of like a corkscrew or like a twisty. I'm thinking very Tim Burton and Nightmare Before Christmas. That kind of a vibe going up the trunk could be really interesting.
I tell you what makes dark oak forests more interesting to look at from above is giant mushrooms. Like, you have the mix of texture, you have the mix of color, and you have a mix of shape. And I think honestly, having a couple of dead dark or pale oak trees in the pale garden biome could really help the atmosphere. I think it could change the shape from above, and it could also be something kind of cool to approach in a more of a clearing where there's obviously less canopy there, so you see more of the gray sky and you just see one kind of gnarled old tree that's lost all of its leaves, and maybe those can generate pale moss around the base of them or something, and it looks like the leaves have all kind of fallen down and also drained the color from the ground around them. There's some scope for creativity here, and I think whether that's left to players or left to the developers, I think there's room for it either way.
Our next email comes from Origami Marie, Willows and Creeks. Hello, Johnny and Joel. I keep thinking about the Pale Garden and hoping that Mojang doesn't miss the opportunity to make something really cool. I'm going to paraphrase here. Origami Marie also suggested that pale oak trees get more of a willow tree shape, with whiter leaves, pale moss that hangs all the way to the ground, especially when near water, for a creepier overall vibe. They then went on to suggest that the creaking is also an opportunity. Regular mobs have a good reason to all look the same. They're patterned after real animals, but the creaking is a tree. Why not have multiple models so they can feel more like trees? You can't actually hit them anyway, so their hitboxes don't have to match their models. Origami Marie was distracted by modding willows in Minecraft and died to a creaking in the background window.
I expect tabbing out is going to be the cause of a lot of creaking related deaths. You already hear people like, going AFK and then getting caught by a creeper because there's a dark area somewhere. I expect the creaking is going to be much the same. I like the idea of there being internal variety to the creaking, with them being organic in the way that they are plant. Like, no two trees are ever going to grow the same. So even though there's something fairly robotic feeling about the creaking right now, I do like the notion of them being characterized by being different looking. And like, one creaking heart is going to produce something that looks kind of more like a zigzag, and another one is going to have like wilder like hair almost, kind of like Ents, the way they designed the Ents in the Lord of the Rings movies, where they all have different characteristics and they're meant to represent maybe different varieties of trees. Even though it's always the pale oak trees that are generating the creaking, there's no real reason why they should all be the same. They're not like iron golems where they all need to be built to like exact specifications. I like that idea a great deal.
I thought it was really interesting that Origami Marie pointed out that because we can't hit them, the hitbox doesn't necessarily need to conform to exactly the same model all the time. Like, you wouldn't want a zombie variant to be too wild, because you want the player to understand where to hit the zombie and what the hitbox is. You'd want that to be consistent. I imagine it also makes things a little bit lighter on the programming and performance side of the game too. But what I was thinking about with the creaking is that, even to make it simple, the torso and the legs could be the same, and then you could just throw on, like, have 3 or 4 different kind of arms, have 3 or 4 different kinds of heads, and just randomly make combos. Like, just have it random generate. Like, head A, arm B, and left arm C, and then roll around with a bunch of different combinations, and you'll have all kinds of different variations that you probably wouldn't necessarily notice unless you're spending a lot of time with the creaking. You'd start to see repeats, but like, I think it would be, something that would add a lot of variety to the people that want to, deal with the creaking on a regular basis. It's such an interesting way to do it. And I think too that, in terms of maintaining the creepiness and the scariness of the biome and the experience, if you look over and something has got that 3-eyed, creaking, orange-eyed look, and it's always the same, then you're just like, oh, that's a creaking. Like, you recognize it immediately. But if you have to wonder whether it's 1-eyed, 2-eyed, 3-eyed, like, are there orange mushrooms that are the same? Like, how do you start to confuse the player and have them kind of like on a pivot going like, is that a creaking? No, it's a mushroom. Is that a different creaking? No, that's also a mushroom. Like, I feel like you could really have some fun by having some, I don't want to say inconsistencies, but some variety in how a creaking could present themselves. Could be very, very different. Maybe the eyes aren't in the head. Maybe the eyes are in the chest. Like, you could move them around and have it. I'm thinking like Guillermo del Toro kind of like fantasy
vibes, absolutely.
Right? Like twisty and creepy, but like, in a way that still has like some gameplay vibe to it, like some puzzle solving or visual kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Illusions, optical illusions as to what's what. Like, what are you actually looking at?
Yeah, I love the idea of them being like one of those like monster flip books that kids have, where it's like, you can put the Dracula head on the zombie body, and you kind of like the ring bound kind of books. Like, I had a bunch of those as a kid. I think. I wonder if maybe they don't add more internal variety to mobs because there's a possibility that players would end up expecting them to act as different mobs, whereas the Creaking's AI is probably going to be similar because of the mechanic that they have set up for it. You tap it, you see where the creaking heart is, and then it sneaks up on you while you're not looking at it. They're never going to do anything different to that, even if they look different, but different biology implies different reasons to have that biology. So, like, if their hands are bigger, their hands have evolved to be bigger, is the kind of connection that we make. So I kind of wonder if players would expect them to behave too differently, and keeping them uniform make sure that you know you're dealing with the same creature every time, and what worked last time will work this time. But if Mojang themselves don't add variety to the creaking, I think there's definitely room for the community to do that. I mean, I've seen pretty cool resource packs adding variant zombie textures, and it just randomly rolls which one it's going to give a given zombie when it spawns in. And so you can imagine people doing stuff like that to great effect, where, yeah, there'll be one creaking that's got a bigger head or like thicker legs or something, and you can kind of mix and match them a little bit that way.
I like the idea of having bigger hands on the creaking too. I think they just have stick arms like Enderman right now. They're not overly.
Yeah, they're kind of tall and reedy and thin, so yeah, they kind of have that Enderman look to them. Well, moving on to the next email from the Pale Garden mailbag. I think this one is going to be. This comes from Imperfect Imp, and the subject is Pale Garden Editions. Hi, Pix and Joel. Since Minecraft Live, I've been thinking about the Pale Garden. I agree with the common opinion that it lacks a unique detail. I liked Joel's idea from episode 317 of the Creaking Eye Mushrooms. I've also seen people suggest other ideas for structures. I'd like to propose standing stones. They'd look man-made, potentially with runes carved into them or flowing around them. The runes could even be in the unused Illager font, since there seems to be a connection between Illagers and the Creaking, since Illagers flee from them. This would convey a bit of the man-made garden atmosphere, create interesting lore, and potentially create options for an enchantment rework later on. What do you think of the idea? P.S. Do you think player-grown pale oaks should be able to grow new hearts, or should they be a limited resource only found in the biome? Imperfect Imp died, but that's fine because he's built himself a graveyard in a pale garden.
Home sweet home, right?
Bless this mess, as always. Yeah, so I want to tackle the standing stones idea first, and then we'll get into the pale oak creaking heart discussion. Standing stones makes a lot of sense to me. They can feel very ominous if you encounter them in the real world. And there's a passage in Fellowship of the Ring. Been thinking a lot about Lord of the Rings lately with the Rings of Power show that you and I discussed on the Citadel Cafe. There's a Barrow Downs chapter where they're out sort of in the mist, and these ominous standing stones are the things that they feel like they're trying to get away from. And even though it's not moving, it feels like it's imposing itself on them and popping up in places where they're going around in circles. And that sort of feels like part and parcel with the idea of the creaking, where like it moves when you're not looking at it and has that kind of looming vibe to it. So I like that aspect. Secondly, stone circles have like folk magic implications in British culture. They're linked to druidic practices and witchcraft, and I think this is already in a couple of Minecraft mods that are out there. I seem to remember the Between Lands mod having stone circles as a generated structure in there, and you either encounter enemies there or it's where you have to build a portal to the Between Lands dimension, something like that. I never played with it, I just saw it played a couple of years ago. But yeah, I think honestly standing stones can have that very creepy vibe, or at least suggest some kind of ruin around which the Pale Garden has grown, and that sort of like reclaimed by nature vibe that I think a lot of Minecraft already has. Things like jungle temples being sort of overgrown and mossy cobblestone growing around them and stuff, and vines dripping down. I do think that's already present in Minecraft, so this doesn't feel unprecedented if they added something like this into the Pale Garden.
I think it works too. I think it has that Stonehenge vibe, like you mentioned. I also think about like the stone circles in Pixar's Brave as like a very creepy, misty set piece, and that ends up where like I think the final fight happened there too between the bear and Merida and everybody. I like that they have this old kind of spiritual vibe, and they sort of look like gravestones too. Like they'd be bigger when I'm like what I'm thinking of in terms of like, you know, Stonehenge and stuff, like they'd be a lot larger. But I like the idea that they could either look like gravestones or be potentially mined and repurposed by players as gravestones or something else. Like it would be neat to have something in the game that would be bigger than a stone wall, but not as big as a stone block. You know, if it was the right color, then you could use it for adding depth to your builds. You could use it for pillars. You could use it for all kinds of things if you could get enough of them, or if you could somehow craft them. You know, if there was some way to duplicate them later. I think that would be kind of a fun way to add versatility into the game. I don't think it necessarily has to look man-made. I think you could even have stone circles or just stone arrangements that could look like sort of man-made, or who knows how they got there.
Yeah.
I do find that a lot of the feedback that we see online or hear about in our inbox gets really hung up on the word garden. And I think
Yeah.
maybe even the North American kind of like definition of garden, when they think like fences and flowers and like cultivated and like
Yeah.
neighborhood garden, right? Whereas like I know that sometimes in places like the UK, the garden could be like the backyard. Like it's just the whole thing is just kind of referred to sometimes as the back garden. And that could be
Hmm.
anything from a postage stamp in a city to an acre. And they could still call it the back garden, right? And I think that garden has more of a broader definition from Mojang here. It's almost like if you were going to hike somewhere and it was called like the Yellow Garden hiking trail. Like you're not expecting to see a garden with white picket fences. You're expecting to like the area is kind of probably meant to give that feeling of a garden, but it's what it's called as a location. I think that's a little bit more with what they're going for, and so I think that my vision for the Pale Garden is more of a natural one. So
Hmm.
I do like the idea of them adding stones though, and I think that could be a fun precedent to add to the game where maybe it's just like groups of rocks. Like when I go hiking, I went on a hike this weekend and there was these really cool chunks of bedrock just like sticking out of the earth and having moss all over them, and having these dark shadows underneath them and dirt and leaves and stuff piled up around them. And that kind of stuff is really, really cool when you get into like ridges and other areas. And I think that that would be a fun thing to add into clearings in the Pale Oak Garden, or as you mentioned, like just to break up the canopy, like having a bunch of stones around that could like be in groups of like 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever. That could be really interesting as well. And then either inspire the player. Maybe it's a new block, like maybe it's a different kind of white or gray stone. Not that we need more of those, but like there could be something that they could add that might be something to be used there. I do like the idea from Imperfect Imp about the runes, though. If you wanted to go like this actually has been touched by someone or something at some point, having the runes floating around them, any kind of motion in this game is going to be great. And any time that you can add some sort of motion to just distract you when you're in a biome that makes you nervous already, I think that would also be cool. Also be a good signpost. Like if you're looking around for some of these runes, if you knew that they were in the game, these stones, and you couldn't find them because it was just hard to see in the biome, then you could look for the floating runes going from place to place. And like, oh, it's probably over there in that clearing because I can see a little bit of motion. And I think that would add a lot too.
I like the idea of this somehow being a really not obscure but kind of like cryptic way of demonstrating enchanting mechanics, if the enchanting mechanics are going to stay the way they are. We've talked in the past about how that's one of the mechanics, putting bookshelves around an enchanting table, that people who are playing Minecraft unspoiled don't really figure out on their own very easily. And if there were almost like carved arrangements, like a stone circle kind of thing, but maybe if the stone was like a new type of chiseled stone that looked sort of like a bookshelf, and then you had something that looked like a carved book stand in the middle, like a carved enchanting table or lectern or something. Like the idea that people might be able to put 2 and 2 together, and that the Pale Garden was a place where, with that kind of circle of standing stones, people used to come in previous times to enchant their books or whatever, right? Like, or enchant whatever items. Like, I like the idea of that being signposted somewhere in game. Although, given the amount of call there has been recently with talk around the villager rebalance and stuff to rebalance enchanting and repair mechanics, I don't know if they want to necessarily create something that signposts enchanting in that way and then, cave to player pressure and end up revising the whole system later. I don't know for certain if they have stuff like that in mind, so maybe that shouldn't be what it does. But like you, I like the idea of there being runes floating around or carved into the rocks. It'd give us more decorative stuff if we could have something like decorated pots, but with carvings on stone. There being sigils or runes of some kind or symbols being put in there. I think you could do a lot with that. So yeah, I honestly think that's a fun idea. Again, if Mojang themselves don't implement that, I'm definitely doing this when I get hold of the biome in-game myself.
How do you feel about additional creaking hearts being spawned in with player-grown trees?
I I'm honestly in favor of it happening, and I recognize that part of the problem is people wanting a reason to go back to the Pale Garden biome, and once you can take a couple of saplings home with you, there's no reason to ever go back there. I personally see that as just the nature of the way Minecraft works. A lot of the time, people are going to want to be able to farm something at home, and right now you can't farm these. They aren't renewable. I really want to use them as a texture, so I'm hoping for a way of having them renewably in future, because if they're not activated, that kind of score of like scratch marks almost through the bark of the tree is a really compelling texture, and I think it's really well designed. It tiles super nicely. I can immediately think of about 10 different ways I want to use it. So I'd really like there to be a way of obtaining creaking hearts without having to completely strip bare every pale garden biome that I find, although I can understand why people might want to do that, because then it reduces the amount of hostility you experience if you go back there to build for whatever reason. But yeah, like, given that we're likely to find these biomes, there isn't a creaking heart in every tree that's there. They're not completely surrounding you. There's really just like a few here and there. You're going to find that you don't have as many of them as you expect. They're going to be a bit like Hearts of the Sea, right? Where, like, when I wanted a stack of conduits so that I could use them as a lighting block in a thematic build, I had to travel so much of the world and even, like, use external tools to try and find the treasure chests for myself, so I didn't have to find all of the individual treasure maps in-game and potentially miss out on stuff that wasn't signposted because a treasure map didn't connect to it. And it takes ages. And I think it's really nice to have a way of getting hold of stuff renewably. The creaking heart feels like it's biologically tied to the pale oak tree, and I recognize that tree farmers are going to go, well, hang on a second, why do I want to be attacked by this thing every time I grow one of these? They only come out at night, and if you're tree farming into the night, then that's, a risk that you're going to take, and you're more than likely going to encounter other mobs if you continue tree farming at night anyway. So as somebody who sleeps basically every night that shows up in Minecraft, I don't see how it's really that much of a risk to tree farming. I think the main thing is it not being a pushable block, and maybe people not being able to farm it automatically is a concern because it requires Silk Touch to get hold of it. But I think that's something that we should at least be given a choice to do, and at least be given the option to do. So personally, I'm in favor of it being farmable and being renewable that way. How about you, Joel?
I'm on the same page. I think it should be renewable, but I think it should be given under player control. Just like when you want to have a bee's nest, you grow a tree
Yes.
that will give you a bee's nest within a couple blocks of a flower. And that is how you decide that you want a bee's nest. And if you don't have a flower nearby, then you won't get a bee's nest when you don't want one.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a great way to handle the people that don't want creaking hearts all the time. If you just want the pale oak because you want the white wood to work with, plant a bunch of trees and not worry about it. You don't have to worry about moss generating underneath them now, and then you don't have to worry about the creaking heart. But if you want a creaking heart, then maybe you have to put moss carpet down within a couple of blocks. Maybe it's a moss block. Maybe you have to surround it with moss blocks. I don't know. Like, pick a mechanic that's similar to putting something from the pale oak biome. Maybe it's a new mushroom that they add that we haven't seen yet, and you have to put that near the creaking heart in order to incentivize it to give you a creaking heart inside the tree. I don't remember what the frequency is for bee nests coming in. It's not every tree, but it's certainly frequent enough that it did not take me very long to build up a couple dozen blocks to put bees nests in a build, because I wanted to use them as building blocks. And so to do that with the creaking heart, it would have to be something that would give you it often enough that you're like, all right, well, I'm going to do some pale oak tree farming. I also want to get some creaking hearts, so I'm going to plant a bunch of these moss blocks or mushrooms or something nearby, and then I know every other, or like every 1 in every 5 or 1 in every 6 trees is going to give me a creaking heart that I can then use. Now, I'm surprised that they stopped them from being moved with pistons. I'm not sure what the reason would be, because I thought they had some pretty cool potential for like redstone and light detection, and like they have comparator output. Like, I'm surprised that they removed the ability to move them with a piston. I don't know. I guess it's just to stay consistent with something like a spawner, maybe.
Yeah.
But I felt like that was a kind of a step back from what they had for potential for players. Again, considering their texture, it would be cool to be able to move them. Like, if you had them as 6 or 8 of them and you wanted to have like a piston door with some really cool texture, or a movable floor that looks like it was being scraped by something, like that would be fun to be able to move them around. But I guess we have to move other blocks over them as opposed to having them be moved. But there's probably ways around it. But yeah, I think that it could be treated more like bees nests, and that way players get control. If they have no interest in the creaking, then that's fine. And I think that also that helps with mini games. That means that if you want to have like 6 or 8 creaking hearts in an arena, just like they showcased in the developer preview there, that you don't have to go and completely dismantle a pale oak biome to get all the creaking. You can just take a couple of saplings home, grow enough trees that you get the 6 or 8 creaking hearts that you need, and then you can make your mini game. So I think it opens up a lot of gameplay rather than hindering it.
Yeah, I think honestly the best solution would be if you have to go to the Pale Garden and grow the trees there in order to get creaking hearts, and they wouldn't generate them in other biomes, because again,
Sure.
that gives players a reason to return to the biome and gives them renewable creaking hearts there, but doesn't necessarily mean that your tree farm built somewhere else is going to be swarmed by creaking every time night falls.
Yeah. Our last email comes in from Zing, and the subject is description. I feel like that's probably a typo on my part. Hey, Pix and Joel. When recapping Minecraft Live, you mentioned how the Pale Garden is great for Halloween districts. While I agree, I think the biome's biggest strength is its ability to create contrast. I think the most effective builds in the Pale Garden won't be gray and brown as we're used to, but instead be filled with more vibrant, colorful materials, which we've conveniently gotten many more of in recent updates. I draw parallels to color pop technique in photography, where a background is grayed out and desaturated around a colorful subject to make it pop more. What do you think? Zing built a bright blue tower in a sea of weeping angels, and the adventure continued.
So if you want to do your Sin City themed like build in the Pale Garden, I can see that working out quite well. Yeah, having like the pop of color with everything else around it feeling black and white. Yeah, like I would like to see somebody try this out. I haven't seen a great deal of people building in Pale Gardens in creative, except to build stuff that feels like it already suits the environment. Like I follow a couple of folks online who've been working on generated structures to appear in Pale Gardens in like mods that they work on, or just structure packs that you can slot in like a data pack. And a lot of them are takes on a woodland mansion, sometimes a little bit smaller, but with the Pale Garden biome as its inspiration. And so a lot of them are that desaturated color already. What I haven't seen as much of is people going to the biome specifically to subvert your expectations of what you find there and throw in something that's bright and like, vibrant colors in the middle of this gray wasteland. So I think that's an interesting concept and one I haven't seen explored very much yet.
I see what they're doing with the comparison to color pop in photography. And I feel like right now, the biome is still pretty boring to build in. So like, even if I am going to build a brightly colored house or something like that, I feel like I still don't want to call the biome home. Like
right.
I don't want to roam around there. If I'm built, like how complicated is this brightly colored build? Like how long am I spending in the biome? Obviously, like you said, like if you don't want to deal with the creaking, then you just sleep through the night. I do forget that they don't come out during the day, because I was thinking in my notes here about like, man, you'd have to clear all the creaking out before you build anything, because otherwise that would get annoying. But again, like if you wanted to do a nighttime build, then you would, you'd probably want to get rid of them. So that could be problematic. But I like the idea of like adding some color, but I feel like when I do that in other biomes, whether it's like a desert or an ocean where you're met with like basically a very singular color for the biome, when you add your other colors, like there's still cool things to do or cool landscapes to see and some variety in those biomes. And I think about Badlands, for example, as a good one. But a white build or a brightly colored build in a Badlands is going to stand out wonderfully. But the Badlands is still interesting to look at. And I feel like walking through a Pale Garden to get to my home base or my current build just doesn't appeal to me. And that's subjective. Like that's just me right now. But it'll be interesting to see. I think sometimes it would depend too on the scale of the biome. The Pale Gardens that I've seen have not been overly large. And I think for this to really work, you'd almost want Pale Garden for as far as the eye can see. And if your pink house in the middle of the Pale Garden is next to a jungle biome, it's going to look just kind of, why is the pink house 20 blocks to the right when it could have been built in the jungle. Like it has to be a wide enough spread effect to have that house or that build, whatever that build is, really pop,
Yeah, I think the main thing you're getting from a Pale Garden biome really is the sky color as well, because you can bring the trees and the moss to other biomes. And while the moss might look a little bit too homogeneous if you're using it everywhere instead of the natural grass color, like you're not getting the grass color in other biomes that you'd get in a Pale Garden, you'd still have easy enough control that you could convert another biome to look sort of like a Pale Garden just by spreading the moss everywhere. And I think that, the main thing you're getting environmentally after that is the sky color and maybe a bit of biodiversity with the grass. So I can imagine people doing a makeover on another biome just as easily, and then being able to have the control over what the landscape there looks like, and maybe have a bluer sky if they wanted to. I think most people who build in dark oak forests also find that clearing out the trees is a much larger task than they expected, so I have the sense that people are going to think the same of the Pale Garden. If they want to build anything substantial there and clear-cut everything, it's going to take you a while. And I think the most effective methods I've seen have mostly involved TNTing all of the trees, because then there's a lot less chopping that you have to do. So you're going to end up with a lot of pale oak wood. You're going to be very popular on whatever server that you're playing on, presuming people want to build with that stuff. But then you're going to be exporting all of that to build something more colorful, just so you can get a gray sky behind it. And I don't know if that's going to be everyone's cup of tea. If it is, then great. But yeah, I like the idea of building something colorful there. We'll see if that becomes a trend. I imagine we'll get a decent amount of people wanting to go to Pale Gardens in one of our patron hangouts whenever the Pale Garden, the winter drop arrives. So we'll see how people end up building there. In the meantime, that's going to be it for our show. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Spawn Chunks. You can find more information about the show and links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today at thespawnchunks.com. The music for the show is composed by me, and The Spawn Chunks is proud as ever to be a listener-supported podcast. If you're getting some value out of the show, why not consider putting some value back in? You can do that at patreon.com/thespawnchunks, where pledging at any level gets you an invite to our patrons-only Discord chat. You can listen to the show live when Joel and I record it in Discord every week. We have our monthly hangouts where we talk about what our patrons have been up to in Minecraft that month, and plenty of other events in the patron calendar, so stay tuned for those. We currently have 309 patrons, which is up 4 from last week, so thank you to the 4 of you for jumping on board. Special thanks, as always, go out to our content engineers, Gundar H. Striker, Hunter555, Jumbo Sale, Mindtrip Media, Party Voyager, and Yitz. Thank you so much for your support on this episode.
Sharing the podcast with your friends is the easiest way to support the show. You can find us at The Spawn Chunks on social media. New episodes are available on Mondays on all of your favorite podcasting platforms, including YouTube, where you can find the video version of the show. You can email us at the Spawn Chunk email address, which is spawnchunkmail@gmail.com, and that is also available on the spawnchunks.com. You can find the RSS feed there as well, and the patron-only RSS feed is on the Patreon page. That's where you can go to listen to the render distance, the extended version of the program.
My name is Johnny, but online I go by Pixel You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/pixelriffs, where the Minecraft Survival Guide is currently in its 3rd season. I also stream 3 days a week on Twitch, where I do behind-the-scenes work for the aforementioned YouTube series, and I'm the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, which you can find through a quick YouTube search. Aside from that, I'm at Pixelriffs on Instagram, and lately I've been using Blue Sky a bit more, so go and find me over there as well. Joel, where can people find you online?
I am everywhere online at Joel Duggan. Very easy to find. You can go to joelduggan.com. Links to my other podcast, The Citadel Cafe, which is about sci-fi and fantasy entertainment. I am Joel Duggan on social media, Joel Duggan on Twitch, and I have been streaming a lot of Satisfactory. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be getting into some Create in some Minecraft modded play, as well as continuing the Satisfactory playthrough. I think if you like Minecraft, you might also like Satisfactory. It's a lot of building. I talk a lot about the same sort of things that I talk about in my other streams: shape language, color theory, all that kind of stuff. So pop on by. It's Joel Duggan on Twitch.
Thanks for visiting the Spawn Chunks. The world outside is infinite, and I hope you're feeling brave.